Today is April 22, 2017. Before we begin, let's ask our Heavenly Family to guide us. Eloheinu, our mighty ones, our wonderful Heavenly Family, thank you for this great day that you've given to us. Thank you for the message of truth. Thank you for the principles of righteousness and love. And thank you for revealing to us the nature of reality and how to acquire knowledge. Please help us to put to use these wonderful tools that you've given to us. And help us tonight in this study to gain an experimental knowledge of reality and to be transformed into your likeness. Thank you so much. We ask all that we do, Father and Mother, B'Shem Tzemach, Hu Hi, in the name of branch, he and she. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so tonight we will continue on the study of the community rule. And as usual, I'll first give a summary of exactly what the community rule is. And then after that, we'll talk about questions broadly related to the community rule and then continue on studying it where we left off. So first, the community rule, as most, if not all of you here are aware, is a text found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was, in fact, one of the first scrolls found, and it is very important for quite a number of reasons. One of the reasons why it is important is because it informs us more than any other single document found in the Dead Sea Scrolls of the community which housed the Dead Sea Scrolls, or which kept, copied, preserved, and so on, these scrolls. And again, the Dead Sea Scrolls, of course, are essentially a Jewish library with books that were copied from the 2nd century BCE, possibly even a little earlier, into the 1st century of the Common Era. And the group of Jews who had these scrolls is typically identified as Essenes, which is one of the main groups of Judaism in the time of Jesus and before. And so, you have the Pharisees and the Sadducees and Zealots and Essenes, among others. And this text, the community rule, comes from the earlier phases of the community's existence and tells us of their theology, their practice, their self-identity, their mission, and so on. And that's highly significant just for understanding the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Jews who had them as a subject all on its own. But of course, for people who are interested in Jesus and his early followers, it has added significance in that what it describes in terms of belief and practice is very much alike what the early followers of Jesus believed and practiced. And in fact, historians have recognized now that the Qumran community, or at least that's a subgroup within the overall community, and I'll take a moment to explain what I mean by that. Basically, there was this community as a whole, known by outsiders at least as the Essenes, and that community had its origin with an individual known in the Dead Sea Scrolls as the teacher of righteousness in the early part of the 2nd century BCE. And at some point in the 2nd century, a core group, at least, of the quote-unquote Essenes, the people who believed in the message of the teacher of righteousness, moved to a place called Qumran on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. And so that was kind of like the headquarters of the Essene movement, and some of them lived there, but Essenes in general lived, of course, in broader areas than just there at Qumran. So anyway, that movement served as somewhat of a forerunner to the Nazarenes. The Nazarenes were the early followers of Jesus. And, when we look at the teachings of the teacher of righteousness and ask, what would John the Baptist think of the teacher of righteousness? What would Jesus think of the teacher of righteousness? What would Paul think of the teacher of righteousness? And ask those sorts of questions, the answer becomes quite obvious that they certainly agreed with his teachings, and thus they would have viewed him to be a true messenger of God, since he did make that claim to be a messenger of God, rather than a false messenger. And, this is really important because everything must be understood according to its context if it is to be understood correctly. You can take anything out of context and make it seem to say something entirely different from what its author or its whether it's writing or just someone saying something verbally. You can take anything and make it say something totally different than what the speaker or writer intended it to say. So, for instance, Psalm 14, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Well, someone could quote from the Psalms, quote, there is no God, and make those Psalms appear atheistic. Well, obviously that would be very much so out of context. Placing different statements in different contexts changes the meaning of the statements. And this also is interesting when looking at the Gospels in the New Testament. Certain of the sayings of Jesus appear in one context in one Gospel and in another context in another Gospel, and it has a different meaning in another context. So, you could say, hey, grab that thing over there and bring it over here. Well, obviously, that is going to mean very different things in very different contexts, because the thing which you are referring to is going to be different in each context. I'm just mentioning some of these things in order to say that in order to understand Jesus and his life, his teachings, his ministry, that of his followers, and so on, we absolutely must view them within their own context, rather than trying to place them in another context, because it changes the meaning, and then we will view them other than how they really were. So, a lot of people have different versions of who Jesus was, what he was about, and so on, because people place things in different contexts. So, we definitely have to be careful to keep them in their own context. And the Dead Sea Scrolls are so vitally important in order to view Jesus and the Nazarenes within their original context. And the community rule is certainly a significant part of that. One of the reasons why is because for a long time, people viewed Jesus and his early followers not within the context of Judaism as being a part of Judaism, but they viewed them as in contrast with Judaism. Oh, so the Jews said this and that and believed this and practiced this way and so on and so forth, but Jesus and the Christians did these things. So it was always in contrast. And, people would look at all these things in the New Testament that aren't in the Old Testament. And moreover, the way people viewed Judaism at the time of Jesus was essentially just a primitive form of rabbinic Judaism. So people think of the rabbis and sages who came centuries later, and the different ideas and practices which they had, and then retrojected them into Jesus' day. And said, oh, this is what Judaism was, and Jesus stood at odds with that. Therefore, Jesus was not a part of Judaism. He was the founder of a new religion, which was really just superseding this dry, dead religion. I mean, yeah, Judaism was good for its time. It was there for a while, but its day was done, and now it was time for the true religion, the true faith, Christianity, and Jesus, the first Christian, was the one who started it all. Well, that's not at all the way it really was. There was no such thing as a Christian in the days of Jesus. Jesus died before anyone was ever called a Christian. Paul, James, Peter, all the disciples, all the apostles, the entire movement that followed Jesus in the first century were not Christians. They were pre-Christian. Christianity developed as a religion in the early second century, of course, basing itself off of the religion of Jesus, but not being the religion of Jesus. And that's a very important distinction.
I think that's a good title for a YouTube video. Jesus was not the first Christian.
I think that's a good title as well.
Provocative.
It is provocative, and people could be interested for different reasons. A Muslim, for instance, might think that, well, we're saying that Adam was the first Christian. Just because Muslims have the idea that Jesus was a Muslim, and Abraham was a Muslim, and Adam was a Muslim. And, it goes all the way back. And so people might think that we're saying the same thing about Christianity, which might actually be interesting to people. Mm-hmm. But, of course, yeah, it's an important point to make. And actually, I want to expand on it a little bit more and how the Dead Sea Scrolls are relevant for understanding that point. So one of the reasons why that idea survived, that being the idea that Jesus and his early followers were not really a part of Judaism, rather they were starting a new religion, which was in contrast with Judaism, is because there were so many things in the New Testament that were not in the Old Testament and not in rabbinic literature. So, for example, in the Gospel of John, there's the Word who became flesh, and he is the light, and he came, and the darkness could not overcome him, and all of these things. And you have the children of light and the children of darkness, and that whole idea and that whole paradigm expressed especially in the Johannine writings, especially John, the Gospel of John, and 1 John, but it's also in Paul and elsewhere. Those ideas are not expressed. That paradigm is not present in the Old Testament. And some of those key terms, sons of light and sons of darkness and all of that, are not in the Old Testament. Oh, so that must be a Christian innovation. That was the thought. And then you have, the idea that people are all supposed to share their possessions and not consider anything to be their own, and all these things, like it says in the book of Acts, and also in the Didache, and also in the Epistle of Barnabas, all early quote-unquote Christian writings, supposedly. And people thought, well, that's not in the Hebrew Bible. This is a Christian idea, a Christian innovation. There are many other things like that as well. It talks about the heavenly sanctuary and emphasizes Melchizedek in the book of Hebrews, for example. Oh, that must be Christian innovation. Nope. That's what people thought. There's this idea of multiple divine beings. That must just be a Christian innovation. No. Oh, wow. In the New Testament, the Holy Spirit is described as an individual separate from God. Well, that's not in Judaism. That must be a Christian innovation. Again, no. But the reason why we can say no to all of those things now is because of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Because the Dead Sea Scrolls belonged to a community of Jews from the 2nd century BCE. This is, the Qumran community started nearly 200 years before Jesus' ministry at least. And yet, all those ideas that I just referenced are present in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So all of these apparently distinctive Christian ideas turn out to be Jewish after all. Just not Jewish how people thought they were, and just not pre-exilic Judaism, that being before the Babylonian exile, and not early Second Temple Judaism in the days of Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah. No, this is mid to late Second Temple Judaism, and that is the Second Temple Judaism of which Jesus was a part. And these things were present in Judaism before Jesus, but they weren't present among all Jews. Some of these ideas were present among many Jews at least. Like, for instance, resurrection. There's not much about resurrection in the Hebrew Bible, as it were. The really ancient Hebrew scriptures don't really talk about resurrection. However, there may be a reference in Isaiah. That may be the earliest reference to the idea anywhere. But not all Jews accepted resurrection. Not all Jews believed in angels. Pharisees accepted both of those views. Sadducees didn't. Nazarenes certainly did. And it's also witnessed to in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But there are several ideas that the Jesus movement had that were not shared by the Sadducees or the Pharisees or the Zealots or any other group other than the group which had the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea sect, as sometimes they are called. And particularly, this is true when it comes to the teachings of the teacher of righteousness. It is able to be shown that the thanksgiving hymns were either entirely or mostly written by the teacher of righteousness. And I believe that we've also shown in our past studies that there are other texts in the Dead Sea Scrolls that were pretty well certainly written by the teacher of righteousness. And in studying those texts, his teachings become quite clear, and you can see his unique points of emphasis. And what's really interesting is that out of all of the writings produced by the teacher of righteousness and his followers, the thanksgiving hymns and the community rule have the most parallels, at least that I'm aware of, with the writings of the early followers of Jesus, to the point where it's evident that at least some of Jesus' early followers were acquainted with, believed in, and possibly even memorized some of the passages in the Thanksgiving hymns and the community rule. The Gospel of John was certainly written by someone who was influenced by the community rule. And in fact, when you read the description of the life of the Nazarene movement in the book of Acts and in the Didache, it looks as though they're trying to follow the lifestyle prescribed by the community rule. So evidently, these texts are very important, in particular the community rule. The community rule is very important not only for understanding the teachings of the teacher of righteousness and the practice which he advocated, but also for understanding Jesus and the Nazarenes, and if Jesus really was the Son of God, and his apostles were really true prophets, true messengers, true sent ones from God, then the community rule is certainly something very, very important. So, with that said, we've been studying it, trying to find out if it is a product of inspiration, and if so, how it should be implemented in our life today. But we haven't really gotten to that aspect too much yet, because we first have to verify whether or not it's a product of inspiration. Clearly, no matter what, it is a text of great importance. But we definitely want to know, is this something which came about through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit? Was it something written by the teacher of righteousness? Was it written by his followers? How does that impact how we view the text? Those are questions that we have to ask. And the community rule has as its goal to produce a people who will bring about the final wiping away of sin. Well, that's the goal that our Heavenly Family has given to us. So, again, very, very important. So in studying it so far, we've been asking questions like, is this true? Is this in harmony with the Word of God? To quote Ellen White. And really just wanting to know the true nature of it. And so we've been reading primarily 1QS, which is the best preserved copy of the community rule found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. 1 is for Cave 1, Q is for Qumran, S is for Serek, the first word of Serek HaYahad, which is the Hebrew name for the community rule. And this particular copy, 1QS, has 11 columns. We are currently in the 4th column. And so far, the content of what we've been reading can be divided into 2 sections. Of course, there are more sections following, especially once we get to column 5. But the first primary section deals with introducing the purpose of the community rule and explaining the covenant ceremony which this community of Jews performed on an annual basis, in which people entered into the community by vowing before God to love all that he loves and to hate all that he hates, and so on. So we've studied that section and found that the things which are said therein are indeed righteous and true and good, and in harmony with what inspiration has said elsewhere. The next section, starting partway through column 3, deals with the teaching of the 2 spirits. And this section we have found to be absolutely remarkable. It puts forward the idea that all things in the world are to be divided into 2 categories: that of truth and that of falsehood. There's the spirit of truth on one hand and the spirit of falsehood on the other. And they are at enmity with each other. The conflict between them is fierce, and they do not walk together. On the side of the spirit of truth, you find the God of Israel and the messenger of his truth, the children of righteousness, light. You find enlightenment, you find humility, you find goodness, You find everlasting righteousness, unending goodness, understanding of all things. It lists all the attributes of this principle, truth. On the other side, the side of the spirit of falsehood, you have the messenger of darkness, Belial, and all the spirits allied with him, who share but a single resolve, to cause the children of light to stumble. They rule over the children of darkness. On their path lies greed and haughtiness and pride and slackness in the search for righteousness, a slanderous tongue, blindness of eye, dullness of ear, stiffness of neck, and hardness of heart, lewdness, abominable deeds committed in a spirit of lust, and all of these various wicked attributes. Those are the two principles, and all things are founded upon one or the other. This idea of this cosmic light-darkness dualism, with this cosmic battle between them, and the terms expressing this paradigm, are not found in the quote-unquote Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. They're not found among the teachings of the Pharisees or the Sadducees or the Zealots. It's not found in the various apocryphal and pseudepigraphal Jewish writings, not found in the writings of the Greeks, not found in the writings of the Romans, in the writings of the Persians, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Sumerians. Not in any of these religions. It's found nowhere until you get to the New Testament. This paradigm, this idea, which all the evidence suggests started at Qumran, or at least started with the teacher of righteousness. That's the more accurate way to put it. All the evidence suggests that this paradigm, this idea, started with the teacher of righteousness. It was one of his grand, unique contributions to human thought and to the messages of inspiration. And it's picked up in the teachings of Jesus and carried on through his disciples. We found parallels to this in early Nazarene writing. Perhaps the most clear parallels are the Didache, first 6 chapters, and the Epistle of Barnabas. I believe it's chapters 18 to 20. But there are other parallels as well in the writings of the early followers of Christ. And this teaching on its own, the teaching of the two spirits, is highly significant. But it is also highly significant that it is picked up and promoted by Jesus and his early followers. It is certainly an evidence that they viewed the teacher of righteousness as being a true teacher of righteousness, as in being a true prophet rather than a false prophet, and thus would have viewed themselves to be continuing along the line in which he was an important part. So they would have viewed themselves, in a sense, as successors to him, just like Jesus was a successor to John the Baptist And John the Baptist would then be viewed as a successor to the teacher of righteousness. I'm sure the teacher of righteousness viewed himself as a successor, in a sense, to previous prophets like Malachi and Zechariah, Haggai, and so on. Going back, and you could go back and just count the prophets backwards, basically. But it's important to realize that there's a gap that people have always thought, oh, well, Malachi and then suddenly John the Baptist. 400 years go by. That's not really how it was, and that's certainly not how Jesus viewed it. So, anyway, that's it for the recap on the community rule. Does anyone have comments or questions broadly related to the community rule? And what I mean by broadly related is that it is related, not just something totally out of the blue, unrelated, but broadly related because it doesn't necessarily have to be so specifically on the community rule itself or on a particular passage. It could be in relation to the teacher of righteousness, the Qumran community, the Dead Sea Scrolls, how all of that relates to the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament or the historical Jesus, the general period of time, 2nd century BCE, 1st century BCE, going into the 1st century of the Common Era. All of these sorts of things that are related to the community rule, but not necessarily directly about the community rule. And the other thing that I'll mention that is very fitting in terms of the sorts of questions to be asked now would be anything related to the principles by which we are conducting our investigation of the community rule, and anything along that line, so our approach to it, and so on. So does anyone have comments or questions? All right, judging from the silence, we'll take that as no questions for now. All right. Well, as I mentioned before, the last place that we left off in the community rule is in column 4. And we are in the paragraph that starts in line 15. For anyone who's listening to this later especially, I'll mention that we are primarily studying from Giza Vermes' translation of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's called The Complete Dead Sea Scrolls in English. And so when we say paragraph, we're talking about the paragraph divisions as found in his translation. It will be different in other translations, which is why we will be primarily referring to the references by giving the column and the line. So 1QS, column 4, line 15 starts this section. And we've already examined a few sentences here, but I'll read this anyway in order to keep the context. So again, starting at line 15. In these are the generations of all the children of humanity, and these being the two spirits, truth and falsehood. And in these divisions all their hosts possess an inheritance for their generations, and in their paths they walk. And the whole reward for their deeds shall be for everlasting ages, according to whether a person's portion in their two divisions is great or small. Now, all of that is stuff that we have discussed already in previous studies. This next sentence we have not discussed so much. For God has established the spirits in equal measure until the final age. and he has placed everlasting enmity between their divisions. So I read that more like Giza Vermez's translation that I have in the past. Another way to read the same thing is, for God has set these as equals until the final age, and has set everlasting hatred between their divisions. There are other translations, but it all gives the same general idea. So does anyone want to either make a comment or ask a question concerning this sentence, or explain how you understand it? Or if in addition to explaining how you understand it, you could also mention whether you see it as promoting true principles or not. So anyone?
Sounds like a true statement to me.
What do you understand it to be? Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say it's interesting. It says until the final age, and so for all time, they're directly opposites of each other, and always have been and always will be. Correct? There's probably a lot about it I don't understand, but that's the part that I understand or thought I did.
Sure, yeah, I'd agree with that. So on this whole final age thing, I want to make a quick comment about that. That is what, I'll just say that this statement is a great example of an expression of a sort of belief system that is called apocalypticism. The apocalypse, it's like the final end of things. And to say that, this is set this way until the final age, is saying that, well, there's going to be a time, and it's like the final time. It's the time when the current order of things becomes totally overthrown, and it's saying that there's going to be this great change at this time where no longer are these two principles going to be, as it were, equals in this battle with each other. So that's showing like, oh man, there's this final end that's so dramatic and revolutionary. And as we'll see, apocalypticism also includes the thought that it's right on the doorstep. And certainly the Qumran community definitely had that perception. Any other comments on the sentence?
I would say it kind of confuses me. Again, like, I know that this isn't true, but on the surface of it, it just kind of seems like it's saying that God's kind of, I know in reality there just are two ways. Well, there's really only one way, but it seems like God's established the other way too. Like he's kind of set up a test for us of sorts, to kind of see what we're going to do. So he's established the Spirit's in equal measure. I don't know, it just seems kind of, I'm trying to think of the word I'm looking for. I had someone tell me once that he thought God was like the controller of like a video game, where, he was just, kind of like, I don't know, setting up a system and then just seeing how it plays out. It just kind of has that feel to me a little bit.
Okay,
That's
sure.
really good.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that's so weird that she should say someone she knows said that, because someone said it was said differently, but it was the very same thing. They said, well, everything is interpretation in the Bible. Well, that's kind of true. But they also said that they've often wondered if God didn't just use this earth as a little testing ground, just to see what would happen. It sounds so much like what Mary's person said. It always used to be confusing to me to think Lucifer was perfect until sin was found in him. It's like, okay, well, anyway, it was his choice to sin. But other people look at it differently. And I also, I don't know about Mary's person, but the person I was talking to has read precious little of the scriptures. They went to church as children, but as adults, they just got a sour taste in their mouth from certain Christians, quote-unquote Christians around them, and they just lost their interest in being a cookie-cutter version of how they were raised. And so then this idea came up, well, maybe Earth was just a testing ground. Maybe there's a bunch of other worlds out there that they were just throwing things out, and one of them was exactly what Mary said in theory. So I don't know if anyone else has had anyone say that to them. So I just thought I'd mention, well, that isn't the only person that thinks that, Mary.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a common idea that I've heard for sure. Where people wonder, aside from the community rule, of course, just, hey, we're all kind of like guinea pigs, and God is just running an experiment just to see this whole evil thing and, how it plays out. Yeah, that's a common idea. I don't think that it's what the community rule is saying for sure. But, I can understand Mary, reading this and thinking, oh, maybe, is this trying to say that basically God is like setting this whole thing up in a sense? And it's kind of like this. There's this classic debate in Christianity between free will and God's sovereignty, is the way that it's expressed sometimes. So people who like to emphasize God's sovereignty in a particular way like to say that really all of this is about God choosing and God glorifying his name and all of that. All of this is just for the glory of God. Some are destined to die, some are destined to live, but it's all for the glory of God. Of course, that's the classic Calvinist position, that, God is decreeing all things, and those who are saved because God has elected them to be saved, and those who are lost because God has decreed them to be lost. And, some even go as far as to say, well, of course, Christian philosophers talk about this sort of thing sometimes, where it's like, oh, God is totally omnipotent. He's all-powerful, which means he can do anything, and he could have done anything. So God could have made any universe, period, like any universe. So he could have made a universe where no one chose to sin, but he chose to make a universe like this where people would sin, and he knew that they would sin. He knew that Adam and Eve would sin, and he placed the tree there knowing that they would choose to sin, and he did this all for his glory, to just show everyone that he is the greatest and his ways are the greatest. And if you happen to be blessed with receiving the gift of faith through the grace of God, then you are one of the privileged ones who gets to see and celebrate how great God is. And for all of those who will be lost, they won't get it, they won't celebrate it, but they're glorifying God indirectly anyway, because they're demonstrating how great God is and how awful life without God is. I'd say that's an extremely twisted view of reality. But people do have perceptions like that, and some people emphasize the sovereignty of God so much, as in God, there's nothing that could possibly challenge God. God is reigning supreme over all things, and if you have free will there, well, that kind of is a threat to God's sovereignty, perhaps. So, that's kind of one way that people view these things. And Calvinists, some Calvinists were pretty excited with some of these writings in the Dead Sea Scrolls, because some scholars interpreted them and translated them deterministically, and some of that is here in Giza Vermez's translation as well. In other words, it's portrayed like the Qumran community were deterministic. And it could be that at some point some of them were. But I don't see that in the Thanksgiving hymns, and I don't see that in the community rule. Josephus, when he talks about the three schools of Jewish philosophy, that's kind of the way that he puts it. He talks about the Essenes as a school of philosophical thought, the Pharisees as a philosophical school, and the Sadducees as a philosophical school. And some of the main things that he describes as differences between them are that the Sadducees believe totally in free will, that all things happen because people choose to make things happen one way or the other, and free will is just a huge part of what makes, basically what forms the future, what takes us from point A to point B and makes things happen the way that they happen. Well, it all has to do with free will for Sadducees. For Pharisees, they believe that some things were by free will and some things were by the decree of God. And then he says that the Essenes believed that all things were by the decree, or all things by providence. I forget the exact term that he uses, but basically no free will, just by the decree of God. And so that was what Josephus said was the view of the Essenes. Of course, Josephus is writing this at the end of the 1st century of the Common Era. We're talking, almost 300 years after the time of the Teacher of Righteousness. So it could very well be that Essenes in his day were deterministic, but the Teacher of Righteousness not being deterministic. Now, and we can show that the Teacher of Righteousness was not deterministic. He did not believe that all things were just by the decree of God, and I'll go through and read you some of these passages in just a moment. But I just wanted to say that me reading these passages and showing that the Teacher of Righteousness was not deterministic does not actually show that Josephus was wrong. It could be that Josephus was right and that the Essenes of his day were deterministic and didn't believe in free will. And perhaps that's one of the things that Jesus and John and the Nazarenes disagreed with them on. But, just because one group at one point promotes a certain thing does not mean that people who they claim to be successors of promoted the same thing. Like today, look at modern Seventh-day Adventism, promoting an immaterial God, promoting classical Trinitarianism, pretty much. I mean, that's not what Ellen White taught. That's not what the early pioneers taught. And it hasn't even been 300 years. And there's plenty of other things. The spirit of prophecy is the writings of Ellen White. So says modern Seventh-day Adventism. That's not what Seventh-day Adventism in Ellen White's day said. We need living prophets. That's early Adventism. We don't need living prophets. That's modern Adventism. There are many other points that we could go through that are different between believers in one generation and believers in another generation, even if they're following the same line. Even looking at Victor Hoddif's day, like we talked about last night, when Victor Hoddif began teaching, this is the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, Seventh-day Adventists at that time believed and taught that at the second coming of Jesus, there will only be 144,000 saints alive to be translated without seeing death. Well, now, very, very few Adventists hold that idea, and they would probably be very surprised to learn that just a couple generations ago, that's what the majority of Adventists thought and believed. So ideas change over time quite a bit. And it could be that, basically how I see things happening is that the teacher of righteousness was not deterministic. He overtly promoted free will, and I'll read you some passages to show that. And that at some point, some of his followers, known by outsiders as Essenes, became deterministic. They came to believe that things don't really happen because of free will. They happen because of God's decree. Josephus then knew of that belief among those people, and he reported that. And then historians over the centuries have been reading Josephus, and they think, Essenes, they're deterministic. And then the Dead Sea Scrolls are found, and people start reading the Qumran writings and start realizing, this group must have been the same as the group that Josephus talked about. Therefore, they must be deterministic. And then the writings were interpreted and translated from a deterministic point of view, or perhaps better put, as if the authors of these writings were deterministic. So that is, what I believe to be one of the aspects in play here. So, teacher of righteousness, not a determinist. That's, I guess, a subtitle. So let me just look through here the Thanksgiving hymns. I know I have several places that I've kind of underlined on this point because I know that it is a point of contention. It's a point of difference among scholars. Okay, so there are several occurrences. It'll take me a little bit perhaps to find a few samples, but here's one from 1QHA, that's the primary Thanksgiving hymn scroll, column 6, and I'm not sure what line this is, maybe around line 7 or 8. Actually, I'll start a little bit before, maybe around line 5. Blessed art thou, O Lord, who hast given understanding to the heart of thy servant, that he may understand all these things, and consider ... and resist the works of wickedness, and bless justly all those who choose thy will. Okay, so there are those who choose thy will, choose the will of God. Well, that's definitely implying choice, definitely implying free will. And I'll just keep reading here. Okay, yes. All those that choose thy will, that is to choose all that you love and to hate all that you hate. And you have caused your servants to have insight into the lots of humanity. For you have cast their lot according to their wills between good and evil, and you have determined their recompense. So they are placed in these different lots according to their wills, according to their choices, and you have determined their recompense or their reward, what follows. But you didn't determine who they are and what they choose to do. So that's very important, that they have the choice according to how this is expressed here. Let me look for other ones. Okay. This is later in the same column 6, around line 25. You have favored me, your servant, with a spirit of knowledge, that I may choose truth and goodness, and loathe all the ways of wickedness. And I have loved you freely with all my heart. That's really good. That's pretty clear that it's free will right there. I have loved you freely. Later, in column 7, line 9 of 1QHA, I have loved you freely and with all my heart and soul, etc., etc. So that's, again, more examples of, this whole freely, I've loved you freely, and so on. Another one in line 18 of the same column 7. They have despised your covenant, and their souls have loathed your truth. They have taken no delight in all your commandments, and have chosen that which you hate. Okay, so again, they have chosen that which you hate. There's a whole bunch more statements like this that emphasize doing things freely and choosing and so on. This is throughout the Thanksgiving hymns, which are among the most certain of writings to be attributed to the teacher of righteousness, which again shows quite plainly that the teacher of righteousness, and most likely then his early followers, were not deterministic, but actually did believe in free will, and thus they would not view God as kind of like setting this whole thing up and everyone's kind of along for the ride. So again, there's a lot more in order to show that. And even in the community rule... Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to mention the community rule on page 103, the next page over in line 5, it says, and this is the rule for the men of the community who have freely pledged themselves to be converted from all evil and to cling to all his commandments according to his will. And I'm not saying that, I know that God is not deterministic. I know, I was just saying that it seems like this sentence could be taken that way. Like God is kind of, purposely putting the path of evil because he's going to, later on it just says he's going to take it away. He's going to destroy it, but he hasn't destroyed it. So almost like he's, testing us. I don't know, but I know he's not really, but that's just the way this verse kind of seems.
Sure, yeah. The first thing that I want to do is just show, hey, look, in the context of the community rule and the broader context of the community, we can know that it's not deterministic. And that the reason why I mention that is just to say that helps us when reading this to check ourselves, to kind of put ourselves in check, like, let's see, if it comes across this way, but then we know that they couldn't have thought this thing, maybe this place means something different. And I believe it does. And kind of what's interesting is that people often assume that kind of like, in a sense, the default is the good, and then God placed the evil here as along with the good in order for it to be some sort of test. I don't think that that's the case at all, and I don't think that that's what this is saying. According to the community rule earlier, it talks about the source of light and the source of darkness. Let me go back to this. Okay, yes. 1QS, column 3, line 19. From the source of light come all the generations of truth, and from the source of darkness come all the generations of falsehood. Okay, so you have these two different sources. There's the source of light and the source of darkness. Okay, so from one come all the generations of truth, from the other come all the generations of falsehood. Okay, so it's not saying that God, and this kind of comes back to something we discussed in past studies relating to line 25 of column 3 that says, for it is he who created the spirits of light and darkness, and we talked about what it means for God to create these things. And we found that it's not saying that he originated them and brought them from non-existence into existence, because that's not what bara means. And, it's talking about how God designated them, he labeled them, he defined them, and so on and so forth. Now here it's talking about him setting them as equals in a sense. In other words, he is having them as rivals here. Now, here's the thing. Actually, I'm going to back up for one moment and try and tie this together a little bit further. And in order to do that, I want to read another thing quickly from the Thanksgiving hymns. And this is from 1QHA, column 5. Oh, it's hard for me to tell exactly what line this is. Maybe line 15? No. This must be line 20 or so. The teacher of righteousness here says, you have made me understand. Your insight you have made me to understand. And the source of your insight you have not hidden. Now, this is something very interesting because it's talking about the source of God's insight, which obviously implies that God has a source for his insight.
I just did a study on this not long ago.
Excellent. Yeah, so it's not saying that God is the source of insight. It's saying that God has a source of insight. Those are two very, very different ideas. So God is not spoken of as the originator of light and darkness. He is not spoken of as the one who decides absolutely all things, because, as we just read, people have free will according to the teacher of righteousness and according to the community rule. So he's not deciding all things. He is not the originator of good and evil. It says, from the source of light come all the generations of truth. From the source of darkness come all the generations of falsehood. And then in the Thanksgiving hymns, it talks about God's source of insight, the source of his insight. Okay, so that's painting a picture which does not fit well within the idea of divine determination, as in God determines all things. And so when you look at this statement in light of all of that, the idea that you get is that God is instrumental in bringing about order. So there's basically, if there is darkness, light is there to counter it. He is establishing, it's basically talking about God declaring war, in that there's this light-darkness battle between each other, and of course it goes on to talk about how they both absolutely hate each other. You know, he has set everlasting hatred between their divisions, everlasting enmity. Well, that's talking about a battle between them. It's talking about war between them. I'm not sure if I'll be able to find it right now, but there's one Dead Sea Scroll fragment that talks about sunrise and sunset, and how basically it's a symbol for this war between good and evil. And let's see if I can find it real quick. I might read it. No, I thought that might be it, but that's not it. Okay. Okay. Yeah, I don't think I'm going to be able to find that right now. Anyway, I know I've read it on the call at least one other time. Oh, maybe this is actually it. I think that there's at least two places. Okay. No, you know, that's not actually the one. That's too bad. One of these, it really talks about light and darkness and the how one, basically the symbolism for good and evil and this war. Anyway, at some point I'll probably find it again and we might read it and discuss it more thoroughly. Anyway, going back to this line in the community rule, for God has established these, or God has set these, either way, as equals until the final age. Now, it's not saying that God created both of them to be the same. He has set them as equals until the final age. So let's just say that you have, you know, two kids in a classroom. Let's just like imagine this from a teacher's point of view. And, you know, let's say one of them is bullying the other or something like that. And so you say, okay, you know what, I'm stepping in, I'm going to do something, and you guys have to do something different. You have to be fair here. I'm going to set you guys as equals in this, and one cannot just bully the other. You know, there are certain rules to this. You have to go about this fairly, and so on and so forth. Okay, well, that's not saying that God made the bully, or that's not saying that the teacher made the bully to be a bully and made the bullied student to be a bullied student. That's just saying that since they already had that character, they were designated to go about things a certain way. You know, I'm sure there are other examples and perhaps better examples that could be given, but my basic point is that this is not saying that God made the spirit of darkness or the spirit of falsehood to be falsehood. It's not that he made it to be what it is. Not that he made the spirit of truth to be what it is. It's that they're both here. They're already contending. They're already in opposition to each other in principle. Like they are really negations of each other. And he is setting them as rivals, as opponents, if you will, until the final age. In other words, all right, they can battle, but then at some point, I'm bringing an end to this. So, you know, all their two divisions, and that includes, of course, everything in their two divisions. So you have this battle between generally truth and falsehood, but also between the children of righteousness and the children of wickedness, between love and hate, between all these things that are the flip side of each other, there's this battle. And in talking about this in the past, I think that this may have been brought up in a study quite some time ago. I'm trying to remember. But it has a relation to the idea of wickedness coming into this world and the creation of the world starting with darkness and God making light. You read Genesis 1, and it doesn't start with light and God brings darkness into the picture. No, it starts with darkness and chaos, and he brings light, and he creates this division between light and darkness. And that's why I was wanting to find that Dead Sea Scroll fragment, because it shows this division between light and darkness to be really talking about this war between truth and falsehood. And so what that shows is that in reality, from the perspective of the Dead Sea Scrolls and from our perspective as well, it's not that God is saying, oh, well, there's this light in the world, and I'm bringing in darkness so that they can fight. No, there's darkness and chaos, and God is bringing light to have them fight as equals, as opponents. And in a sense, one could say that that's a sort of test or experiment, but it's not like a guinea pig trial or God just doing this for his own amusement. And it's not even for his own sake at all. It's just that God is saying, okay, well, there's no way around it. We have to let this run its course. We have to have this battle take place, because that's what these two opposing principles are. They're really opposing. And we've talked about this before, how after Lucifer sinned, it's not like God could just, okay, well, I'm going to just take you out, and that's it. And everyone else will just do the right thing from now on. No, it would not have worked like that. It would have been further war, further battle. It would have perpetuated everything, and then eventually our Heavenly Family would have to do what they're doing now anyway. So, that said, the whole idea of God setting them as equals is really a good thing, because the devil is the god of this world. And when we study the battle of the gods, pre-creation, and all of that, we can see that really the enemy has dominated this place with darkness, and our Heavenly Family introduced truth into the world in order for this war to take place, rather than just leaving it all to be darkness running unrestrained, and things just getting worse and worse and worse and worse. Even with the battle, in a sense, things are getting worse. But God has set them as equals until the final age, and then truth will be decreed, and so on and so forth. We'll come to that. It's here in this same section of the community rule. But ultimately, this is talking about this war and God declaring war. Obviously, God's on the side of truth, and darkness comes from another source, according to the community rule, and this war being waged between them is fierce. God isn't like, it's not like he is an outside party to this war who's just viewing the war and happened to set it up like that. No, according to this, it's actually like, again, this battle is between the God of Israel and the angel of his truth on one hand, and the angel of darkness, Belial, with all the spirits allied with him on the other hand. And that the angels of darkness are seeking to destroy the children of light, but the God of Israel and the angel of his truth help all the children of light. And so it's for it to say that God establishes them as equals until the final age and has set everlasting hatred between them, is not trying to say that God is some external party that is indifferent to the spirits of truth and falsehood and is just watching to see what happens. Obviously, he's on the side of truth and fighting for truth, and in order for him to set them as equals means that he is putting truth into action to oppose falsehood rather than putting them both into action to oppose each other. Because, as it says right after this, truth abhors the works of falsehood, and falsehood abhors all the ways of truth, and their struggle is fierce in all their arguments, and they do not walk together. Before this, at the end of column 3 going into column 4, it says, one of these spirits God loves for all eternal ages, and in its deeds he is pleased forever, and the other he abhors its counsels, and all of its paths he hates for all time. So hopefully that explains it in a helpful enough way. I think keeping that in mind, that it's not like God is setting them both in action against each other. It's that God is setting truth in action against falsehood. That's what must be concluded by the overall portrayal of things here in the community rule. And certainly in harmony with that other Dead Sea Scroll fragment that I couldn't find that shows light and darkness, day and night, as representing this war. And of course, in light of Genesis 1, darkness was here first, and then God brought light into the world to war with darkness. So anyway, any comments or questions on that?
I was thinking about this as you were talking and kind of looking at the word established a little bit like the word creation, and thinking about equal measure, the two spirits or whatever. There's always a right and there's always a wrong. And so when you look at it that way, they are equal. You always have a right decision, you always have a wrong decision. And so God, in one sense, if you look at established like creation, God has sort of separated, ordered, named. You could say that there could be confusion. Somebody born into a family that's full of falsehood, that's all they know. And so the world could look really confusing. And so to have it ordered and defined and named and separated in their two separate categories helps to eliminate confusion and gives a person who's trapped in a world of falsehood a chance to make a right choice, to see truth. But they have to see the difference between the two in order to make that decision. So it actually gives somebody a chance for truth that maybe otherwise wouldn't if God hadn't established, the difference between these two spirits.
Amen. Well said. Our phone is going to cut out in 2 minutes, basically. So I think in order to finish this without having to really rush majorly, I'm going to hang up and call right back. And maybe as I'm doing that, you guys can think if there are any other comments or questions that you have in relation to this sentence. And if so, we'll talk about that. And if not, then we'll bring an end to the call. So be right back. Okay, we are back. So are there any comments or questions in relation to this sentence?
I have one question that I've heard brought up a few times when talking about free will and how original sin is a creation of the Catholic Church and not necessarily, not the truth. Is that Revelation says that Jesus Christ was slain from the foundation of the world, or the Lamb was slain from the foundation of the world, and that also kind of gives an impression that there was going to be original sin, that Jesus, it just sets up the idea that God knew that this whole thing was going to be a debacle, and he did it anyway, and So Jesus Christ died even before the earth was made because we were going to sin. Do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, sure. That's an excellent question. So first, I'll say that the idea and the statement that the Lamb was slain from the foundation of the world really has no connection to the idea of original sin. And one has to make a lot of kind of leaps in order to get from one to the other. And the only reason why someone might read that and think, oh, well, that must mean this, is if they have built up a whole conception which assumes original sin and then reads that into the meaning of the phrase. But a lamb being slain from the foundation of the world does not imply original sin. Again, original sin is not just an idea that there would be sin. It has so much more to it. This whole thing is kind of like someone finding out that let's just say Jesus is divine, the divinity of Jesus. And someone goes, oh, well, that means that the Trinity is true. And people actually do that. People actually, there's debates out there on the internet over Trinitarianism, and it's all about the divinity of Jesus. And what people don't realize, or some people don't realize, is that the divinity of Jesus is one thing, and Trinitarianism is a totally separate question in many regards. I mean, yes, the divinity of Jesus is included within Trinitarian theology, but Trinitarian theology is not the only theology which includes the divinity of Jesus. And so when people try to say the divinity of Jesus, therefore Trinitarianism, it really doesn't make sense. And it would be the same thing for someone to say, oh, lamb slain from the foundation of the world, therefore original sin, because there's really no immediate connection between them. Again, original sin has the idea that Adam sinned, Adam chose to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and his nature was changed because he, from committing that act, gained a disease to his immaterial soul. And Adam then passed on a derivative of that immaterial soul to his descendants through the sexual act. And so the idea is that, oh, well, when every human baby is born, or even before they're born, when they're conceived, they not only are made of physical material, but there's this soul that is also implanted into the matter that is them. It's not like God sends a new soul. The idea is that Adam and Eve had within them all the souls of all the humans who would ever exist, and when their soul was diseased, that all of these souls were diseased already, and so everyone sinned in Adam. That's the idea of original sin, that everyone sinned in Adam because he sinned, and all of us, all of our souls contained with him, became diseased, and thus when we're born, we are already sinners. We are already diseased because of what Adam did. So that's the idea of original sin. Do you see how that has a lot to it? Like, that includes the idea of having an immortal, immaterial soul. It has to do with the sin of Adam. It has all this theology tied to it, and all these ideas. And the expression, lamb that was slain from the foundation of the world, has none of that stuff. None of the necessary components of original sin are at all even implied by a lamb being slain from the foundation of the world. And so that's the first thing that I want to point out, just how huge of a chasm there is between the idea of original sin and a statement like that, just so that we can really get the idea, like, okay, yeah, this is definitely like a huge leap to take to say that this equates to original sin. So what does it mean then? What is it talking about when it's saying lamb that was slain from the foundation of the world? Well, how I understand it, and this is how Ellen White understood it as well, is that from the foundation of the world, Jesus gave himself up. He sacrificed his whole self. He was ready. He chose. The plan of salvation was set. And he is giving himself. He's pledging himself for all of humanity, even if that means coming and dying for them. That's how Ellen White described it. And I think that that's entirely in harmony with truth, and I believe that that is the way that it really was. I do think that Jesus, or I'll say that the pre-incarnate Son of God, probably knew that he would die. And this doesn't necessarily mean, by the way, before the creation of Adam and Eve. I'm not saying that that's impossible, although I wouldn't say knew at that point. I would say considered as a possibility. So, in other words, before Adam and Eve sinned, I would say that it would be definitely considered as a possibility that, hey, let's consider that where this might go and how to deal with this. Because remember, this world, this whole system that we're familiar with came into place, like the creation of Adam and Eve and all that. This took place after the rebellion started in heaven. The way Ellen White describes it in Spiritual Gifts is that the rebellion started, war started in heaven. There were already plans before the heavenly rebellion, already plans to make earth and all of that. And then the devil, started this war, and then it's this debate, okay, well, look, we've been planning to do this. Do we go ahead and do it anyway, in spite of this war that has broken out? Yeah, let's do it. But we understand that if we're going to move ahead and do it, there are risks. And so that's the whole idea of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that it is a way to test their loyalty to see what side are they going to be on. We have to have some means of knowing whether they're choosing good or evil before it gets way out of hand. And we have to have a way of confining this deceiver. And so, in essence, the way that this whole thing has progressed is that our heavenly family has been prepared ahead of time for each possible downfall. And then at that point, they're saying, okay, well, we are going to provide a remedy. And so I think that they really considered it as a great possibility that the Adam and Eve would fall, but they didn't know it as a certainty. And then, but I think that the plan of redemption was already in place when they made the world. In other words, just in case this goes wrong, what are we going to do to accomplish this? And Ellen White kind of talks about that as there being already some sort of plan of redemption. But then there's also places where she talks about kind of making a plan of redemption, or at least furthering the plan of redemption after that, maybe specifying it further or whatever. So, slain from the foundation of the world is just saying that he had given himself completely for the sake of humanity. And, I mean, the other thing to keep in mind is that from the foundation of the world doesn't mean before it was ever created as we've already seen, even before creation, as it were, the earth was already here and all of that. So it's talking about the beginning of things, talking about at the time, before life as we know it, that there was this lamb that was slain from the foundation of the world. So, yeah, it's Christ's self-sacrifice, him giving himself up for the sake of us. It doesn't imply that he absolutely knew 100% sure that he would die before Adam and Eve even sinned. However, I would say that after they sinned, I think that it was probably pretty certain at that point where this was going. And he was prepared to go ahead and do that. Now, obviously there's still possibilities that it could happen differently, but I think, it was pretty well headed in that direction, and our Heavenly Family could and did anticipate that. And that in no way applies original sin. Original sin is an entirely separate issue. So does that answer your question?
Yeah. I mean, I understand with free will, of course, I suppose there did have to be a plan, just in case. Does that apply for all the world? I mean, did Jesus and the sister, were they just creating Earth? Was Earth their special project, or did they team up to create many worlds? I mean, I know that there's a lot of different worlds. I'm sure the plan of salvation would hold true for the whole universe, right? Same plan, I would imagine.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Okay, so I can't really answer that just by saying yes or no, because that might mean different things to different people. So I'm going to have to explain a little bit more. First, I want to say that so far as we know, the experience of Earth is unique in that Earth was made after the heavenly rebellion began. Now, that's a really important difference if all of these other worlds were made before, because they would have witnessed the rebellion, and thus they would see things differently. They would view things differently than we would, and wouldn't so much be placed on quarantine, as it were. But Elamite does talk about how each planet has their own tree. They have their own test of loyalty, and so every planet has the option of joining the rebellion or continuing as part of the heavenly kingdom. As to what would happen, let's just say on Earth no one sinned, but on another planet someone did. I'm not sure exactly how that would be dealt with. Obviously, our Heavenly Family would do something to try and remedy that and, redeem the people and so on. I mean, people often think, oh, well, why was there no plan of salvation for the angels? Well, there was, actually. Our Heavenly Family actually tried to give them the truth and, encourage them to repentance, and they actually could have repented and all of that. Elamite talks about that. And but eventually they just, continued on in that war. And it was just, they chose to go past the point of no return. Not that our Heavenly Family said, no, sorry, too bad, you're past the point of no return. They, in principle, did that, and our Heavenly Family recognized that and thus wouldn't allow them back into the heavenly kingdom. And the fact that they warred after that against our Heavenly Family exactly proves the point, that they didn't have a change in heart. They were not abiding by the principles of truth. So there was some sort of plan of salvation for them in bringing them the truth, and that's really how we're saved anyway, by the truth. And possibly that sort of thing would be the same thing for a planet which witnessed this rebellion and was not made after the rebellion started. I don't know if there would have been an incarnation and all of that, because that may not have been necessary, because Jesus had already shown his character. He was already unknown to them as being the divine Son of God for a long time. He already made himself to be like them, and they thought he was just another angel with them. And so they already had the experience of something like an incarnation, in that, here he is, just one of them, and all of that. There wouldn't be a need necessarily to have the exact same experience that we have here, because of their different knowledge and their different experience. But there would definitely be some sort of plan of salvation. So hopefully that answers at least some of your question.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Awesome. Any other comments or questions?
Well, I just wanted to say real quick, I missed just a little bit of that because I had to let the dogs out, but I don't think you, right at the last there, you said there would have been some sort of plan of salvation. I think that was referring to the angels. Was that correct?
Referring to the other worlds.
The other worlds.
Yeah, like if it had happened, for instance, that another world went into sin rather than Earth, or in addition to Earth, whatever it may be. Yeah.
Well, so since everyone else was created beings, wouldn't the plan of salvation always have to have been one of the gods that gave up their life as the sin bearer for, to take the sins of those others on them, just like it is here? Wouldn't it have to be one of them?
Let me ask you, what does people being created beings, or any sort of being, have to do with any sort of necessity for anyone to become one of them and die?
Well, I was thinking along those lines. I thought, because of something I read in Sister White's writings, where it said an angel couldn't have died for mankind. It had to be one of the Godhead. Is that a correct statement? That angels even offered their lives?
Now, to be specific, it's not that it had to be, no angel could have done it. It had to be someone of the Godhead. Specifically, it had to be the Son of God, not because he's divine, because he didn't die as a divine being. He died as a human. He died as a man. So it's not like, there has to be some sort of sacrifice and it has to be a God rather than an angel. No, it's, hey, someone needs to go save them, and it needs to be one of them, a human, fully human, someone who is not a divine being, if you will, in order to give them the example and to show that even in fallen human flesh they can live. And the reason why it had to be the Son of God, or at least one of the reasons why it was him rather than the daughter or the mother or the father or an angel or something like that, is because he's the guy who made the plan. And he's not like, okay, sis, go ahead. No, he's the one who made the plan. He's the one who was the risk taker, if you will, in that he said, rather than putting an end to this for Adam and Eve and just taking them out, I'm going to provide a remedy for them. And I understand that as a result, a whole lot more sin is going to happen. So therefore, it's only right that since I'm the one who's making it possible for all this other sin to happen, that I'm going to be the one to go and have, to have to deal with that personally, and to have all of that weight placed on my shoulders, of course, metaphorically speaking. And, and that's what he did. because it just makes sense for him to be the one to do it, because he's the one who created that possibility, because he's the one who made the plan that extended this period of probation beyond that initial sin. So it's not like there's any, like, and really think about it, there's nothing, like, it really doesn't make sense at all for there to be, like, some just thing out there in the universe, some rule that, oh, if people sin, a God has to die for them. It can't be an angel, it has to be a God. And remember, and I really recommend that you go back and listen to the study, The Truth of Sacrifice, because Jesus did not have to die. No being has to die in order for people to be saved. It's not, and, you know, there's no sort of thing like, oh, well, like when people have this picture that someone just had to die because all of this sin and the wages of sin is death, like people use these phrases, but they don't understand what they mean, and are just saying like, oh, well, there's this rule because God said that the wages of sin is death, therefore someone had to die, and it had to be someone who is just so great in order to, like, kind of count for the same amount of people as have actually sinned. And, you know, one human may just count for one other human, but you could have a God that counts for everyone. And so therefore he had to die. That whole idea is based on an absolutely wrong view of atonement, a wrong view of substitutionary death, and a wrong view of the nature of Jesus and several other things. So, yeah, I really recommend the Truth of Sacrifice study.
I'll see if I can find that. But, yeah, I was just sure that Sister White did something really close to that even angels offered to, let's just say, risk their life. You just said he didn't have to die. But I need to understand that better because I'm not fully getting it right now, based on years of other thinking, I guess. So I'll get back with you after I.
Okay.
Yeah, after I read up on that, because it's like right now, it's like I was sure she said that. Well, anyway, I'll just have to watch that.
Right. Well, if you notice though, I didn't dispute that she said something.
Yeah.
Along the lines of not an angel but the Son of God, you know. Mm-hmm. But what I was pointing out is that the whole understanding that you expressed as to what that means and why that would be is not at all something that she expresses, and it's very, very different. Like the understanding of the atonement, the understanding of the nature of Christ. You know, Ellen White did not teach that Jesus, that the Son of God had to die, that divinity had to die. Angelic nature, it couldn't die. You know, it wouldn't be good enough. A divine being had to die. Ellen White opposed that idea, and in fact she said that divinity did not die on the cross. She said that humanity died, that Jesus was human and he died. Right. You know, that's a very different thing from, you know, and think about how little sense that would make if the whole point is that, oh, well, Jesus had to come because he was divine. Well, but then why strip himself of divinity? You know,
I should have worded it that my understanding would have been then that it had to be him to offer to be incarnate and live a life as a human and all that in order for it to be that. So I'm still hung up on that, even though I totally understand what you're saying, that the deity part of him did not die.
The other thing is that it was possible for Jesus not to have to die at all. It was possible that people would have accepted the truth before Jesus even became incarnate, that Adam and Eve could have repented and all of that, and he wouldn't have had to have died. And it's possible even that after he came and was here, that the children of Israel would have accepted him, and the kingdom would have been established on earth, and he wouldn't have died, and all of that, and all of that would have been way better. The death of Jesus was a very unfortunate thing. It wasn't a necessary thing. It was an unnecessary necessity. It's really like Paul in 1 Corinthians 2, he says, speaking of wisdom, he says that if the princes of this world had known her, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. You know, if they had really knew wisdom, they wouldn't have crucified the Lord. He doesn't say if they really knew wisdom, they would have tied him to an altar and killed him that way. Or if they really knew wisdom, they would have, done some other, still crucified him on the cross just without anger in their hearts. Nothing like that. It's that they would not have killed him. If they were working in harmony with wisdom, they would not have killed Jesus. There was no need for Jesus to have died. It's only because of the hardness of people's hearts that they murdered him. This isn't a good thing. God wasn't looking down on the crucifixion and thinking, yes, finally, my plan is finally coming to pass, and now I'm getting to save all of humanity. No, it was covered in darkness. God couldn't even watch. Angels wept. It was the most horrific moment in the history of the universe. It was a bad thing. Jesus should never have had to die. The only reason why he died is because people sinned to kill him. It's because they rejected the truth and rejected him who was the embodiment of the truth. He was living it out, and they just couldn't take it. And so they put an innocent man to death for no reason at all, for no good reason. And, of course, there's a cause. Like, they had reasons, but their reasons are actually a lack of reason. That's why I'm saying for no reason, literally. And so, it's a really, really bad thing. But now that Jesus has been crucified, now that he did die, our Heavenly Family is able to take that event. And again, I'm not saying this is without anticipation. They anticipated it. They already planned to turn it around and use it for the sake of proclaiming the truth. Just like is done with martyrs, right? How the blood of martyrs was as seeds of truth and so on. The blood of Jesus is like seeds of truth. His example, his death, the fact that he went all the way just to live out the truth and to proclaim the truth is itself an example. So it's an example of the utmost love, someone dying for their friends, and it is the example of the utmost hate and wickedness, people killing a perfectly innocent man. And the combination of those two lessons is what turns the absolutely horrible nature of the death of Jesus into the beautiful means of salvation. Like, the fact that it's so horrible, in a strange way, turns it into being the most beautiful thing because of the fact, like, it's just so absolutely touching that something so good can come from something so bad. Like, that is one of the things that's so amazing about it. So that's, this subject I could probably talk forever on because it's so amazing, so profound.
Question?
Sure.
So how would it worked out without him dying?
Well, here's the thing. A statement like that is so broad, or a question like that is so broad. It's kind of like, what would we have done if we didn't do this particular thing? What would we have studied if we weren't studying the community rule tonight? Well, the fact is there's literally thousands of other options, and if Jesus didn't die, things could have gone in thousands of different ways, and depending on what time of history you're looking at. But if what you mean is, if in Jesus' day, like let's say he came and taught his teachings just like we know he did, and then his last week going to Jerusalem, and he went there for Passover and all of that, and let's say that last week the people who were plotting to kill him had a change of heart, and they realized, man, this is wrong. We're going to kill an innocent guy. No, let's change this around, and let's just say that they totally had a change of heart. They came to accept him as the Messiah, and that everyone from that point basically was receptive to truth. Well, then basically what would happen is that he would have taught them all the gospel, and they would all, or as many as are willing, would have actually received justification by faith, stopped sinning, and then all things would be restored. Exactly how that would go about.
The kingdom would have been set up.
Happening. Yeah, the kingdom would have been set up. That's exactly what would have happened, and that would have been by far better than what did happen.
Amen.
And that's what Jesus wanted to happen. Let's keep that straight. So often we think that, Jesus didn't come to establish a kingdom and all that. He just came to die. Well, if in retrospect he came to die, but that's only a statement from retrospect. Like, in other words, he came only to die, because that's what ended up happening. But that's not the reason why he came when he came. He came to teach the truth and to establish a kingdom. You read the Gospels, what was Jesus' message all about? The kingdom of God is at hand. What was his kingdom what was his message all about? It's all about the kingdom. He told his disciples that they would sit on 12 thrones and rule over the tribes of Israel. He's there to establish the kingdom. He's not there to come to an end and die. No, he's wanting to proclaim the truth for people to get it and to establish a kingdom. That was his goal. And unfortunately, because of the hardness of people's hearts, it did not happen like that. And eventually, at some point, he realized that. And really, when the way Ellen White talks about it, when he really realized that it was not going to happen the way he wanted it to, was just a few days before he died. When he really realized was just when he was coming into Jerusalem, and he looks over the city and weeps. That's when he realized, oh man, they are not going to accept me. They're going to kill me. And he obviously knew that they were already plotting to kill him. They tried to take him several times already in the past. And at that time is when he knew, this is really like within a week of his death. So his whole mission was not, okay, I'm going to come here, teach for a while, and then get crucified. No, he was really intending to do something a far more, now it's hard for me to express this rightly, far more immediately earth-changing, in a sense, something of more immediate national and international consequence and notice. That's what he was really hoping to do. But of course, that one event now our Heavenly Family has managed to turn this horrible event into this amazingly important event that has radically changed the world and will radically change it even more than it already has.
It's still waiting to be happened because Sister White said we could have been in the kingdom within 2 years if we would have accepted Jones and Wagner message.
Amen. Okay, so we have been on the call for a little over 2 hours now, so we should wrap it up. So if no one has any other comments or questions in relation to this, and by the way, I'm glad that we ended up talking about this because it's just so important.
Amen.
Yeah, amen. So would anyone like to thank our Heavenly Family, and then we'll end the meeting?
I'll do it. Heavenly Family, I thank you so much for tonight's meeting. I thank you for separating the two ways out for us and making them clear to us so that our choice will be, or should be, easy, I should say. Please help us, Heavenly Sister. Thank you for guiding us into all truth, and I pray your hand of blessing upon each one of us. Thanks for a beautiful Sabbath day today, and give us a wonderful week of study and sharing the message and learning. In the name of the branch, he and she, we pray. Amen.
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 All right. Love you guys very much. Have a good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.